In a village in northern Lebanon called Bechiale, local tradition holds that 16 olive trees growing there are the very trees the dove plucked its branch from, the one it carried back to Noah to prove the flood was finally over. Nobody can confirm that story. But some researchers who've studied the trees themselves believe they could be several thousand years old, possibly among the oldest living things on Earth. Here's the part almost nobody realizes. Age isn't even the strangest thing about them. The strangest thing is that they're still producing oil. Right now. This year. Because the olive tree doesn't really die of old age. Cut it to a stump, burn it, starve it of water for a decade. It sends up a new shoot from its roots and starts over. The same tree, technically, refusing to stop. That single trick is the reason a small, bitter, wind-battered fruit tree from the hills of the eastern Mediterranean ended up doing something almost no other plant in human history has managed. Wheat fed civilizations. Grapes enriched them. Olives did something rarer. They became food, fuel, medicine, trade currency, and sacred symbol, all from a single tree, all at the same time. By the end of this, you'll understand why Athens named itself after the god who gave them this tree. Why Rome built a literal mountain out of the jars that once carried its oil. Why were Olympic champions crowned with it instead of gold? And why a bacterium now spreading across southern Europe threatens to do something that empires, invasions, and 2,000 years of war never managed. Let's start at the beginning. Because the tree that built history almost didn't happen at all. The tree older than history. Around 9,000 years ago, a wild, scraggly tree called Olea europaea was clawing a living out of the rocky hillsides of the Levant, the stretch of land that today covers Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. It wasn't impressive to look at. Small, hard, bitter fruit, twisted branches. The kind of plant that survives specifically because nothing else can grow where it grows. Somewhere around 7,000 to 6,000 BC, someone started eating it anyway. Archaeologists have pulled charred olive pits out of the ground at sites from this period, burned scraps from cooking fires that have somehow survived 9 millennia. Alongside them, ancient pollen, buried in layers of soil, recording that olive trees were already part of the landscape long before anyone deliberately planted them. Here's the detail that mattered. The wild olive happened to be growing in exactly the region and climate where humans were first experimenting with controlling which plants lived and died. The hot, dry summer, wet winter rhythm that would define an entire style of agriculture for millennia. Early foragers weren't just picking a fruit. They were standing next to a plant that, unlike almost anything else edible around them, didn't need replanting every year to keep producing. Chop it down, burn it, neglect it for a generation. It comes back. No wheat field does that. No fig orchard does that. This one tree had a biological loophole that would eventually let empires build fortunes on top of it, and none of them had any idea yet. How humans tamed the olive. Consider an early farmer in the Levant, walking between wild olive trees, noticing something. This tree makes fatter, oilier fruit than that one. Multiply that observation across generations, across hundreds of trees, and you get domestication. Not a single invention, but centuries of patient selection. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Olive trees can be cloned. Cut a branch from your best tree, root it, and you don't get a genetic gamble like you would from a seed. You get an exact copy of the tree that already proved itself. This is also the hidden reason those ancient trees in Lebanon and Crete can plausibly exist. A grove that looks ancient may be the same genetic individual, regrown from its own roots long after the original trunk is gone. Hold on to that detail. It resurfaces later, in a garden outside Jerusalem. Next came the press. A heavy stone, crushing fruit, oil pooling out beneath it. This is where the story stops being about food and starts being about power. A basket of olives spoils in days. A jar of oil doesn't. It can be sealed, stored for years, shipped across a sea, taxed, stolen, fought over. The moment humans figured out how to turn olives into oil, they weren't looking at a fruit crop anymore. They were looking at the beginning of an economy. The oil that built the Mediterranean. Fast forward to around 3000 BC. On Crete, Minoan palace complexes are stockpiling enormous ceramic jars of olive oil, not just to eat, but to hoard, the same way a modern treasury hoards gold. Oil is wealth now. The Mycenaeans who follow do the same. And in their case, we don't have to guess at the details, we can read them. Bronze Age scribes at the palaces of Pylos and Knossos kept meticulous clay accounting tablets, written in an early script called Linear B, that were only ever meant to survive a single year before being recycled, and only exist today because the palaces that stored them burned down, accidentally baking the clay into something permanent. Buried among records of grain, wool, and weapons, archaeologists found something surprising: recipes. Palace workers were blending olive oil with coriander, sage, and honey to manufacture perfumed oil, a luxury export shipped across the Mediterranean to buyers as far away as Cyprus. 3,000 years before the modern perfume industry existed, Bronze Age Greek bureaucrats were already writing down exact formulas for scented olive oil on government paperwork. It's another group entirely, though, who turns the olive from a regional luxury into a Mediterranean-wide obsession: the Phoenicians. Consider a Phoenician sailor, somewhere around 1600 BC, loading his ship at the docks of Tyre, not just with cargo, but with olive cuttings, wrapped and packed for a voyage he doesn't yet know the end of. Sicily, Sardinia, southern Spain, North Africa. Everywhere his ship's hull touches new shore, olive trees follow within a generation. He isn't just a trader, he's redrawing the agricultural map of an entire sea. None of it moves without the amphora, that narrow-necked clay jar you've probably seen in a museum without knowing what it actually was. It wasn't decorative. It was engineered to stack tight in a ship's hull and seal liquid against weeks of rocking, salt spray, and heat. Standing in the hold of a Phoenician trading ship, you'd find hundreds of these jars, wedged shoulder to shoulder in the dark, groaning against each other with every wave, carrying enough oil to feed a city that hasn't seen the ship coming yet. By the time Greek civilization rises to its peak, oil is already crossing borders as a full-blown international commodity, with its own shipping routes, its own packaging, its own markets. In Greece, that commodity is about to become something closer to religion. Athena's gift to civilization. The story goes like this. The gods Athena and Poseidon are competing for the loyalty of a new city. Poseidon slams his trident into the ground, and a spring bursts forth. But the water is salty, undrinkable, useless. Athena offers something quieter: an olive tree. Food, oil, wood, light. The people choose the tree. The city takes her name. That's myth, not history. But it's a fairly accurate summary of how much the Greeks actually depended on this plant in real life. Olive oil on the skin before wrestling. Olive oil burning in the household lamp after dark. Olive oil in the cooking pot and on a body at a funeral. The word gymnasium itself comes from Greek men training nude, skin slicked with oil. At the ancient Olympic Games, champions weren't handed coins or medals. They were crowned with a wreath cut from one specific sacred wild olive tree at Olympia, and that wreath could genuinely be worth a fortune, because Olympic victors were often showered afterward with land, tax exemptions, and lifetime free meals from their home cities. A twist of leaves from one tree could functionally make you rich for life. Harm someone's olive grove in Athens, meanwhile, and you weren't looking at a slap on the wrist. Athenian law treated it as a serious offense, because everyone understood a simple fact. A grove takes years to mature, and destroying it doesn't just hurt someone today. It erases their family's income for the next decade. Greece worshipped the olive. Rome was about to industrialize it. Rome's liquid gold. At the height of the Roman Empire, roughly 320,000 jars of olive oil arrived in the city of Rome every single year from Spain alone. more than 20 million liters from one province, to keep one city running. Walk into an ordinary Roman household on any given night. The lamp burning by the door, olive oil. Dinner cooking over the fire, olive oil. The oil rubbed into your skin after the baths, olive oil. Half your medicine cabinet, olive oil. Even the soap in your hand started as olive oil. One product, running almost every hour of a Roman citizen's day. Roman writers like Cato the Elder wrote entire manuals on how to farm it properly. Roman engineers redesigned the press itself, building screw-driven systems that squeezed out far more oil, far faster than any stone crusher before them. Certain emperors and elites built fortunes and political leverage almost entirely on control of the oil trade, the ancient equivalent, as one historian put it, of modern oil barons. The state itself got involved directly, maintaining official reserves of oil in massive warehouses near the river port, treating it as too strategically important to leave entirely to private merchants. An empire this dependent on one product had a problem: fraud. Premium oils, like the famous Vinafram oil, prized across the empire, were valuable enough that merchants started secretly cutting them with cheaper substitutes: rose oil, sesame oil, mastic resin, even turpentine, anything that could fake the right color and smell without an easy taste test giving it away. Pliny the Elder documented the scam himself. So Rome built a defense. Every amphora leaving a Spanish port carried a titulus pictus, a painted inscription listing the producer's name, the region, the weight, the quality grade, and the merchant responsible for it. A 2,000-year-old paper trail, so that when a jar showed up short or watered down, someone could be tracked down and held accountable. And when those jars were finally empty, cracked, and unfit to reuse, oil residue left them permanently rancid, dock workers systematically smashed and stacked them, layer after layer, at one dumping site on the edge of the city, sprinkling lime between the layers to kill the smell. Over 2 centuries, that dumping site grew into a hill, an actual hill, made of nothing but broken oil jars, an estimated 53 million of them. Today, it's called Monte Testaccio. It still stands 35 meters tall in the middle of Rome. You can walk it. You can put your hand on a broken jar rim that once carried oil from a Spanish grove to a Roman kitchen 2,000 years ago. Hold on to the fraud story, though. It isn't finished. It resurfaces, in almost exactly the same form, nearly 2,000 years later, on a modern supermarket shelf. But empires like Rome don't last forever, and when this one finally cracked, the olive didn't disappear with it. It went somewhere far stranger. The sacred tree of 3 faiths. It went into scripture, and, remarkably, straight into etymology. In the Hebrew Bible, it's an olive branch the dove brings back to Noah, the first sign that the flood is finally receding. According to the story told at Hanukkah, a single day's worth of ritual oil in the rededicated temple in Jerusalem burned for 8 days instead of 1. A miracle still commemorated by lighting candles for 8 nights every winter. Ancient Israelite kings and priests weren't crowned with speeches. They were anointed, oil poured over the head to mark them as chosen. The word Messiah comes from a Hebrew root meaning the anointed one. Every time that word is spoken, somewhere underneath it is a jar of olive oil. Christianity carried the imagery further than most people realize, right down to the ground itself. The garden where the Gospels say Jesus prayed the night before his arrest was called Gethsemane, a name that comes from the Aramaic for oil press. He wasn't praying near olive trees. He was praying at the site of an actual olive oil production facility. And in a twist even modern science has weighed in on. Several of the ancient, gnarled olive trees still standing in that garden today have had their trunks radiocarbon dated to roughly the 12th century, meaning the wood now growing there took root during the era of the Crusades, on roots that genetic testing suggests trace back to one older parent tree. 2,000 years of layered history, standing in one small garden. Evidence this time, not just tradition. In Islamic tradition, the olive is described in the Quran with striking reverence, held up as a blessed and enduring tree. Three religions, three very different theological worlds, and sitting quietly at the center of all of them, the same tree, the same oil, passed hand to hand across 1,000 years of history that otherwise diverged in almost every direction. A tree sacred enough to survive scripture is sacred enough to be worth killing for. Wars fought beneath the olive branch. When Rome finally fractured, its olive-growing heartland didn't go up in smoke, it got inherited. The Byzantine Empire took over the eastern Mediterranean groves and kept the oil economy running for another 1,000 years, even as its borders shrank around them. Then, in the 7th and 8th centuries, Arab armies swept across North Africa and into Spain, and olive cultivation went with them, into Andalusia, where new irrigation techniques, including sophisticated water wheel systems, pushed the groves even further than Rome ever had. Venice, meanwhile, built merchant fortunes on controlling the flow of Mediterranean goods, olive oil among them, taxing it as it moved between ports its war galleys effectively policed. Later, the Ottoman Empire absorbed vast olive-growing territories across the eastern and southern Mediterranean, and land ownership tied to olive groves became so central to provincial administration that entire tax systems were built around counting trees rather than counting people. Even the Crusades, fought on paper over religion and territory, tore through some of the oldest, most valuable olive-growing land on earth, the very land we just stood in outside Jerusalem, sometimes wiping out groves that had taken generations to establish, sometimes marching straight past trees already centuries old by the time the armies arrived. Why did this keep happening, campaign after campaign? Because of one fact every commander understood. An olive tree takes years, sometimes decades, to reach full production. Burn an enemy's wheat field, and they replant next spring. Burn their olive groves, and you've erased their grandchildren's income. Destroying a grove wasn't collateral damage, it was a weapon. Control who profits from these hillsides, and you don't just control a crop, you control the durable wealth of an entire region for a generation. That's history being shaped by a tree. But eventually, ships stopped just crossing the Mediterranean. They started crossing oceans, from the Mediterranean to the world. Consider a Spanish missionary in the 1700s boarding a ship bound for the Americas, olive cuttings wrapped carefully alongside his other cargo, determined to recreate a piece of home in a land that had never seen this tree. Those cuttings took root in California mission gardens, planted alongside chapels and vineyards as part of a self-sufficient religious settlement, and quietly laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a major American olive oil industry, centuries before anyone in California thought to bottle it as a premium product. The tree kept spreading into Argentina, Chile, and Peru, wherever the Mediterranean-style dry summers and wet winters could be found. Later, Australian and South African growers, chasing that same narrow climate window, planted their own groves half a world from where the story started, sometimes using cuttings that could trace their ancestry, tree to tree, all the way back to those same Mediterranean varieties first cloned by Bronze Age farmers. Here's the strange part. For all that global reach, the olive never really adapted the way wheat or corn did. It didn't conquer the tropics or the far north. 9,000 years after those first foragers in the Levant, the tree is still, stubbornly, a creature of exactly one kind of climate. It just found more places on Earth that happened to match it. Then, in the 20th century, scientists started asking why certain Mediterranean populations barely got heart disease. Why science calls olive oil extraordinary. For most of history, olive oil was just dinner. In the mid-1900s, researchers studying diets across Greece and southern Italy noticed something that didn't add up. People eating heavily oil-based diets, vegetables, legumes, fish, and constant olive oil, showed dramatically lower rates of heart disease than populations eating more red meat and processed fat. The detective work zeroed in on two things hiding inside the oil itself: monounsaturated fats, and plant compounds called polyphenols, both studied intensely for their possible role in protecting the heart. That research effectively invented the Mediterranean diet as a global wellness phenomenon and created an entirely new obsession with quality. Extra virgin olive oil has to be extracted mechanically, with no heat and no chemicals, which is precisely why it's classified and priced the way it is. Professional tasting panels now exist purely to sniff and taste raw oil samples, trained to detect a whiff of mustiness or a hint of rancidity invisible to an ordinary shopper, the same way a sommelier detects flaws in wine. That quality premium recreated Rome's oldest problem, and then some. By the late 1990s, investigators found olive oil, cut with cheaper oils like sunflower or hazelnut to fake the good stuff, had become one of the most frequently adulterated food products in the entire European Union. In Italy, investigators eventually traced much of the fraud to organized crime, a network nicknamed the agro-mafia, estimated to run a business worth roughly $16 billion a year, deodorizing cheap imported oil with chemicals and rebranding it as premium Italian extra virgin before shipping it to supermarkets in the United States. One televised investigation suggested that a majority of extra virgin olive oil sold in America at the time may not have actually met that standard. 2,000 years after Roman inspectors started writing quality grades onto wet clay, modern investigators are running laboratory spectroscopy and courtroom prosecutions to catch the exact same lie, at a scale the Romans never had to imagine. But this ancient survivor, the plant that outlasted empires, plagues, and centuries of war, is now facing an enemy small enough to fit on the head of a pin. The disease-killing ancient trees walk through an olive grove in southern Italy that's been alive since the Middle Ages, and today you'd find every tree around you dead. Branches bone dry, bark cracked, an entire landscape of living history turned into standing skeletons in the space of a few years. That's not a hypothetical. That's Apulia, right now. In 2013, researchers there confirmed a new killer, a bacterium called Xylella fastidiosa, which clogs a tree's internal water vessels until it essentially starves itself of water it can no longer transport, even with plenty in the soil. It's spread by a tiny insect, the meadow spittlebug, hopping from tree to tree, infecting one after another for months before any symptoms show, which is part of what makes it so dangerous. A grove can look completely healthy while it's already quietly infected, and by the time the leaves start scorching from the tips inward, the damage is often already irreversible. The math is brutal. Millions of trees dead in southern Italy alone since the outbreak began. Within a couple of years, officials gave up on eradicating it and shifted to containment. Mandatory measures like clearing ground cover to strip away the insect's breeding habitat, an admission that this fight might not be winnable in the traditional sense. It hasn't stayed in Italy either. It's since turned up in France and Spain, and researchers warn a warming climate is likely to widen the territory where the bacterium and its insect carrier can survive. Now put a face on that statistic. Somewhere in Apulia right now, a farmer is looking at a tree his great-great-grandfather already inherited as an old tree, a tree standing before Columbus reached the Americas, and watching it die in a single season, from something too small to see. That's not an abstract agricultural loss. That's a family losing something older than their entire recorded history, in the time it takes a season to turn. Layer onto that drought, wildfire, and land lost to urban sprawl, and you get an uncomfortable question. After 9,000 years, is this finally the thing that beats the olive tree? Can the world's oldest trees survive? Betting against the olive tree has a poor track record. In Becile, Lebanon, the sisters are still standing, still producing oil, at an age locally claimed to reach 6,000 years, a figure that remains local tradition rather than confirmed science. On Crete, the Vouves tree is estimated by some researchers at around 4,000 years old, with other estimates running lower or higher. It still draws thousands of visitors a year and still bears fruit good enough to press. It's also already made its own small mark on modern history. Branches cut from it were woven into the victors' wreaths at the 2004 Athens Olympics. The same ancient custom from Olympia, running through a single living tree, straight into 21st century television broadcasts. Near Bethlehem, a tree known locally as al-Badawi is claimed to be similarly ancient, again without firm scientific confirmation. None of these ages can be nailed down with the precision of a birth certificate, but even conservative estimates place several of these trees well before the Roman Empire. And even when a tree looks finished, burned, hollowed out, reduced to a blackened stump, it frequently isn't. New shoots push up from the same root system that's been surviving underground the entire time. It's the same trick that let ancient farmers clone their best trees 9,000 years ago, and the same trick that let a Crusader-era garden outside Jerusalem stay rooted in something far older than itself. Farmers, scientists, and conservationists across the Mediterranean are now using that resilience deliberately, breeding resistant cultivars, fighting the insects that spread the disease, and pushing for heritage protections for the oldest trees so they're treated as living monuments, not just crops. Some entire olive landscapes have already earned UNESCO recognition, an acknowledgement that what's at stake isn't just agriculture, but an unbroken chain running back toward the Bronze Age. Whether that's enough, nobody can say yet. But every bottle of olive oil on a store shelf right now carries an absurd amount of history inside it. 9,000 years of cultivation, the perfume recipes of Bronze Age palace scribes, the myths of Athens, the fraud inspectors of Rome, the scripture of 3 religions, the trade routes of Phoenician sailors, and the modern science of the Mediterranean diet, compressed into a few hundred milliliters of pale green liquid. The tree that helped build civilization is still out there, on hillsides across the Mediterranean, doing exactly what it's always done. The only real question left is whether we'll still be able to say that in another 1,000 years. Outro. The olive tree never asked to become sacred or imperial or scientific. It just grew, slow, stubborn, rooted in soil too dry and rocky for almost anything else, and human civilization built itself, piece by piece, on top of what that tree could offer. Wheat fed empires. Grapes enriched them. The olive became something rarer, food and fuel and medicine and currency and scripture, all from one tree, all at once. Empires rose on it. Religions wrote it into their holiest stories. Wars were fought over who got to control it. And through nearly all of it, somewhere in the Mediterranean, an olive tree just kept growing. Maybe that's the real twist of this whole story. It's not that the olive tree built history, it's that it simply refused to stop outliving it.